Now, if you've seen my reviews of episodes 1 and 2, you know I enjoyed both those installments of the Star Wars saga, though I did have issues with them, especially episode 2, where the characters seem to get lost in an all too expansive and mostly confusing story that feels much too big for one movie to try and tell. And don't get me wrong here, the Star Wars saga movies are supposed to be grand, sweeping stories about a galactic-wide struggle between good and evil, but in order for those massive stories to be able to be told, and told well, within a relatively short 2-hour and some minute movie, they have to focus primarily on the characters and their personal struggles. They have to be about the journey of a few individuals, not so much about the chaos and epic struggle going on all around them. And perhaps the true beauty of the original trilogy is it was very much character driven. We followed this ragtag group of rebels, mainly Luke, Han, and Leia, and a few others, through this huge conflict which, when you really think about it, we never learned a whole lot about. Episode 4, or A New Hope, just throws us right into the mix, and all we ever really learn throughout the course of 3 movies is that the Empire is bad and needs to be stopped by the Rebellion, and that the Emperor and Vader are truly evil, and that Luke needs to become a Jedi to hopefully somehow stop them. And even though we don't learn why the Emperor and his Empire are bad, how they came into power, or anything along those lines in the original trilogy, we still wanted to see them defeated, and that was mainly for the sake of our heroes. We wanted to see them prevail because we cared about them, because we related to them, and not necessarily the galactic struggle they found themselves mixed up in. And why episode 3 is far better than the previous 2 episodes, and why I put it alongside the original trilogy and call it a great Star Wars movie, is because it focused on the characters and made me start to care about their fate, even though the biggest problem with all of it, and maybe the prequels in general and episode 3 in particular, is we already knew what that fate was going to be. We knew going into it that Anakin was going to be defeated by Obi-Wan, and that he would become Darth Vader. We knew Yoda and Obi-Wan would end up in exile, that Luke and Leia would be born, and somehow Anakin wouldn't know about it. We knew with about 99% certainty that Padme would die, though when taking into account Leia's lines in Return of the Jedi to Luke, about how she had images and feelings regarding her real mother, there was a chance Padme would survive for a time. But of course, she mysteriously died in childbirth, which left us all wondering if Leia actually remembered her mother from literally the first moment of her life, which feels odd, or if there was some other reason why. And speaking of Padme's mysterious death, that's one of those moments in this movie that I both loved and hated at the same time. Because if, as some theorize, myself included, Padme was somehow killed by Palpatine at that point, as part of his master plan, then I think it's brilliant. I think Anakin falling to the dark side because he wants to save Padme, but he ends up losing her nonetheless, is a great tragedy, especially if the one who promised they could save her is the one that secretly killed her. I mean, otherwise Padme just gave up the will to live right after she'd just given birth to twins, which seems like a pretty good reason to want to live. Then when you factor in she probably wouldn't want Anakin to ever find out about those twins, well, it seems odd that she'd so quickly give up on life and protecting them just because Anakin, the love of her life, had fallen to the dark side. I mean, if young people in the real world could die from a broken heart, I dare say the number 1 killer in the world would be, well, broken hearts, because almost all of us suffer a pretty bad one at some point in our life. Anyway, at least in this movie, I did feel much more of a connection between Anakin and Padme. There was some chemistry there, whereas in episode 2, there was very little if any at all. Even though Lucas did feel the need to again have a scene in which these two had to tell us just how much they loved each other, which was again a problem episode 2 had. Instead of showing us that they were falling in love, it felt like they were telling us they were falling in love. And that just comes off feeling very artificial in my opinion. Thankfully, that really only happened once in episode 3. Now, another great example of us being shown instead of told was the entire first act of this movie, which in my opinion was not only the prequels at its finest, but Star Wars in general at its best. This movie kicks off with us being shown that the Republic is winning this war that had just started last we saw at the end of episode 2. And for the record here, I'm not going to be taking anything into account regarding the Clone Wars animated series here, which did greatly enhance both episodes 2 and 3. Anyway, we see the Separatists have launched what looks and feels like a last resort attack on the capital of the Republic and captured Palpatine in the process. And of course, it's up to Obi-Wan and Anakin to save him and the day. And what I really love about this opening space battle, other than just the impressive scope of it, is how with just a few lines they showed the difference between Obi-Wan and Anakin. And that was when Anakin wanted to go back and help the clones that were getting blown to pieces, thus showing his compassion, his weakness that would be his undoing, and what Palpatine would use to ultimately turn him. And it also showed us that Obi-Wan, even though later we'd seen a couple scenes with Cody that he also had a good rapport with the clones, still knew he couldn't let his personal feelings for them get in the way. Obi-Wan understood and accepted that the clones had a job to do, and so did he. Then we get on board the ship, and the fight between Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Dooku happens, and we're shown just how powerful Anakin has become, far more so than Obi-Wan, who gets sidelined early. Of course, we still had to get the unnecessary line from Anakin telling Dooku how powerful he'd become, even though it was obvious right in the scene. Thankfully though, Dooku's comeback to that about double the pride and twice the fall was a nice one. Then of course Anakin defeating Dooku, and then holding both a red and blue saber at his throat while under the watchful eye of Palpatine, his future master, is just awesome and chill-inducing, because unbeknownst to Anakin, he's just passed Palpatine's test, and is about to pass another one when he ultimately decides to behead Dooku at Palpatine's request. And the look on Dooku's face when he realizes what's going on, that he's being replaced, is perfect. Not to mention, I've always loved how Windu says of Palpatine later in the movie that he's too dangerous to be kept alive, which was the same reasoning Palpatine gave to Anakin to kill Dooku. Now, after this action-packed start to the movie, it does slow down a little bit, which is fine because it both allowed us to catch our breath, and it did a great job of setting up just why and how Anakin would not only finally fall to the dark side, but why he turned on the Jedi and could even become so misguided into believing they were the evil ones. And that was of course thanks to the brilliance of Palpatine, which really gets showcased in the middle portion of this movie as he begins to plant the seeds of doubt in Anakin's mind about the Jedi. And perhaps the best scene in the whole movie, maybe even the whole trilogy for me, is during this part of the movie, and that would be the Opera House scene, where Palpatine tells Anakin about the mysterious Darth Plagueis the Wise, who had learned how to cheat death itself. And this, of course, as Palpatine no doubt knows, is very relevant to Anakin, who is having visions of Padme dying in childbirth, visions Palpatine could somehow be responsible for. And then after this brief slowdown to set up the finale, the movie of course ramps it right back up again, with Obi-Wan Kenobi being sent to destroy General Grievous and end the war, which is all fine and good and does make sense, and yet Grievous almost feels like he's in this movie just to give Obi-Wan something to do at this point, a reason to leave Anakin behind. He also feels like an excuse to have a character wielding 4 lightsabers and to have a chase scene, which is something that has pretty much become a staple in Star Wars movies. Because we really don't learn anything about General Grievous at all, and if he got removed from the movie entirely, you could just have Obi-Wan go with Yoda to Kashyyyk to help the Wookiees, and free up all that time you spent on Utapau having Obi-Wan fight a character that, again, was pretty much a throwaway one. And sure, we do learn more about Grievous in the Clone Wars animated series, though we mostly just see him constantly defeated and running away. Either way, what this movie has done brilliantly up to this point, and what it will do throughout the homestretch, is not getting bogged down by the details. Yes, this great galactic war is reaching its end, but the importance of that, and any need to understand the finer details concerning it, gets overshadowed completely by the characters as they approach their ultimate fates, and where we will find them when Episode 4 begins. Which, for me, is the exact opposite feeling I had during all of Episode 2. Even today, knowing much more about the backstory of that movie, mostly thanks to the Clone Wars, I still watch Episode 2 and try to figure out why these characters make the decisions they do, and what in the hell is going on with the story itself. I don't connect with the characters at all because everything is feeling forced and contrived, especially Anakin and Padme falling in love. But with Episode 3, I don't have that problem at all. I'm enjoying the ride and can relate to these characters and their struggles. I can easily feel the emotion and the conflict in Anakin after he learns Palpatine is the Sith Lord they've been looking for, and when he's left with the choice of turning him over to the Jedi and losing Padme, or betraying the Jedi to save his wife. In that one scene at sunset, where he's sitting in the council chamber right after Windu has gone to arrest Palpatine, and where we hear Palpatine's voiceover as we cut back and forth between Anakin and Padme, is filled with far more emotion than the first 2 prequel movies combined. And say what you will about Hayden Christensen's acting overall, and yes, what I'm about to say may sound harsh, but it's not intended that way exactly. But Hayden does his finest work when he has nothing to say at all. There are a few scenes throughout the prequels where his look literally said it all, and said it perfectly, and this was one of those scenes. Soon after this, we of course get Anakin's turn to the dark side when he chooses Palpatine and his wife over Windu and the rest of the Jedi. And although I do have some issues with just how quickly Anakin turns and is willing to go and destroy the rest of the Jedi, I do think this movie tried the best it could to set that immediate turn up. Again, showing how, from Anakin's point of view mostly, they didn't trust him and wouldn't make him a master. Is it still a little hard to believe Anakin would suddenly march on the Jedi Temple and slaughter children? Well, sure, but at this point, he's pretty much all in, and he knows there's no going back from what he's done. Not to mention, Yoda's words in The Empire Strikes Back ring true here. Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny. Consume you it will, as it did Obi-Wan's apprentice. And I think the moment Anakin chopped off Mace Windu's arm was the moment the dark side had indeed completely consumed him, which of course can also show just how dangerous messing with the dark side can be, and also makes when Luke turned away from the dark side at the end of Return of the Jedi all the more impressive. Then we get yet another emotionally packed scene as we witness Order 66 and how it impacts Master Yoda, and John Williams' score at this moment is, as usual, perfect. In fact, his score in this movie and throughout the whole prequels, to be honest, is absolutely brilliant. Simply put, Star Wars would not be what it is today without his music. In fact, I would love to see a cut of the original Star Wars movie, or A New Hope as it's commonly referred to today, with his music taken out and replaced by the cheesy sci-fi music that most movies from the 70s featured. Because something tells me without him, I wouldn't be here talking about Star Wars today 40 years later, that it would instead be thought of as just some old sci-fi movie from the 70s. That's how important I truly feel the work of John Williams has been to Star Wars. Anyway, moving on to the last two duels, the ones between Sidious and Yoda and Anakin and Obi-Wan. Well, both are certainly visual spectacles to say the least, especially between Obi-Wan and Anakin, which goes on so long and features so many different sets that it seems to traverse all of Mustafar. And that is both a compliment and a criticism, because the fight does feel a touch on the long side and does go a bit over the top at times. Though it is still cool to behold, and a lot of credit has to be given to both Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor for truly bringing it and their awesome saber work. And yes, perhaps the biggest problem with the fight is how it ends, with Obi-Wan boldly declaring he has the high ground, as if that's it, it's over and Anakin should just deactivate his saber and yield to Obi-Wan and they should call it a day. However, how I've always looked at it is it was just Obi-Wan trying to bait Anakin to do something stupid and end the fight. Because obviously, Anakin didn't have to try to flip over Obi-Wan. He could have tried to force push him, or he could have tried to jump directly at him, or done one of a number of other things. But since Obi-Wan essentially challenged him, Anakin in his cockiness just couldn't resist it. Was it the best way for this fight to end? No, but at least the emotional exchange afterwards worked, for it was some of the best acting the prequels had to offer. And again showed that sometimes when Hayden Christensen had nothing or very little to say and just had to act with his face, he was at his finest. Now, overall, I love Revenge of the Sith. I do. It truly feels like a Star Wars movie to me, whereas the first two prequels missed the mark a bit. Again, because I feel like they get wrapped up too much in the bigger picture and just lose the characters. And make no mistake here, I'm a guy who loves to know all the ins and outs, all the little details behind the story. But I also understand that characters make great movies. If I don't care about what happens to the characters, if I don't feel their pain and their struggles, then the rest really isn't going to matter. And thankfully, with this movie, I do feel like Lucas remembered that the story here was a lot more focused and never left me wondering, not once, what in the hell was going on and why. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of Episode 3. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Is it the best of the prequels? Is it the worst? Leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.